one thing I would ask is on the Bible is, at what point in Christianity did we see the Bible as we know it today? Not the King James translation specifically, but this kind of agreed upon set of books that kind of provides the basis for local and general worship.
Yeah. In some ways, that is even later than the history I've gotten up to so far.
Really?
Um, there is general early agreement about sections of the New Testament. For instance, if we're going to go all the way back to the second century where we started this story, around the same time that Justin Martyr is writing, there's another Christian named Marcion who becomes
Yes.
becomes the boogeyman for all Christians who follow him. He is the arch heretic of early Christianity. And one of the things that later Christians don't like about Marcion is what he thinks the Bible should be. And what Marcion thinks the Bible should be is first, no Old Testament. He thinks the Old Testament in its entirety should be tossed out. He thinks there should only be one gospel and one apostle. So his one gospel is his own version of what seems to be closest to what we call the Gospel of Luke, although it seems to be missing some parts and other parts are slightly different. And then by one apostle, he means the Apostle Paul, his own collection of Paul's letters, which are not exactly like our collection of Paul's letters. So Christians, some other Christians are horrified by this and respond. I mentioned how dependent Justin Martyr was on the Old Testament and on interpreting that in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. So there are other Christians at the same time as Marcion saying, no, 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 the Old Testament is our scripture. Jesus quotes the Old Testament. Paul quotes the Old Testament. We need to keep the Old Testament. Um, Soon after Marcion, by about 180 AD, a Christian named Irenaeus of Lyon insists that there has to be four gospels. Uh, and for him, those are the gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And most Christians after Irenaeus believe that. And those do become a cornerstone of Christian preaching. More the Gospels of Matthew and John than Luke and Mark. Mark sort of gets left by the wayside. Much of Mark is found almost verbatim in Matthew and Luke anyway. So Christians in their preaching seem to have a real preference for the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John. But the idea that there should be four Gospels is alive and well by the end of the second century. Um, then moving forward, already by the end of the second century, different collections of Paul's letters also exist. There's some debate over which ones should be included, it seems, but there is a collection that's alive and well by the end of the second
Right.
century as well. Texts that take a long time to get included are texts like the Book of Revelation. That seemed weird to a lot of early Christians, and so they're hesitant to include that. Some of the texts that found in our Bibles today, just before the Book of Revelation, also took some time to be included. Christians weren't certain that texts like Second Peter or Jude were actually written by Peter or Jude, and there was a lot of debate about whether those should be included. Um, so it took quite a bit of time. The first time in the history of Christianity um, that in terms of the texts that survive to today, the first time that we find a list that looks exactly like what we have in our New Testament today is about 367 AD. Athanasius, a Christian named Athanasius, writes a festal letter and lists in that letter what he thinks should be in the New Testament, and that's the first time. So 367. Um, so yeah, that's after the Council of Nicaea. That's long after Constantine. So and that didn't settle the debate either. The debate really continued. In fact, in some ways, it continued up through the Reformation. When Martin Luther translated the New Testament, there were certain books that he left out of his table of contents and that he stuck all the way in the back of the Bible, such as the Epistle of James. He wasn't a fan.
Oh.
He thought it contradicted some of the primary teachings of Paul, and he was a huge fan of Paul. So he stuck James way in the back, along with the Book of Revelation, and didn't include those books in his original table of contents. So he wasn't bold enough to exclude them entirely, because he had a whole history of Christian tradition behind him that did include those books, but he didn't think they were as valuable as other books.